Machiavelli, if alive today, would see a world drowning in emotional sensitivity, a society that values being seen as kind more than being effective. He would not adjust to it, he'd dissect it. He'd find modern weakness in our craving for validation, in families trying too hard to be perfect, in workplaces suffocating under politeness, and in schools where students are told confidence comes from affirmation instead of achievement. His methods wouldn't be gentle, they'd be surgical. And through them, he'd craft 7 brutal lessons, not to make people cruel, but dangerously confident in a world that mistakes emotional fragility for moral superiority. 1. Stop trying to be liked, start being respected. Machiavelli would walk into a modern home and see parents negotiating with their children like diplomats instead of leaders. The child throws a tantrum over chores, and the parent pleads, bribes, or apologizes. Machiavelli would scoff. "You are teaching weakness, not love," he'd say. He'd remind parents that affection without authority breeds rebellion, not respect. His advice would be clear: stop asking for love, earn respect through firmness and consistency. If a teenager refuses to follow a curfew, Machiavelli wouldn't chase them with guilt, he'd let silence and consequence do the teaching. The next morning, no shouting, no scolding, just calm removal of privileges. The message becomes clear: authority doesn't beg, it enforces. In school, this same principle applies. A teacher trying to be friends with students ends up losing control of the class. Machiavelli would tell that teacher, "You're not here to be loved. You're here to be listened to." Respect lasts longer than charm. At work, he'd see the same pattern: employees trying to be liked rather than competent. The Machiavellian worker, however, earns silent admiration through mastery. They speak less, perform more, and demand respect through results, not smiles. And in business, he'd say, the handshake means nothing without leverage. To be respected in deals, you must hold something the other wants, not their affection, but their necessity. 2. Control your emotions, or they will control you. Machiavelli would observe modern society as one giant battlefield of emotions, people canceling each other, families exploding in group chats, employees quitting because of tone. He'd grin and whisper, "The one who controls their emotions controls everyone else." In a family argument, he wouldn't raise his voice once. He'd let others shout, burn out, and then strike calmly with logic. The loudest voice loses the room, the calmest one wins it. At school, he'd watch teenagers crumble at criticism, mistaking discomfort for trauma. He'd tell them bluntly, pain is feedback, not oppression. Emotional endurance, not validation, builds confidence. In the workplace, when a rival tries to provoke him with subtle insults, Machiavelli wouldn't react. He'd take notes, remember, and later outmaneuver them in performance reviews or presentations. His calm would not be kindness, it would be precision. He'd weaponize patience. In business, Machiavelli would see emotion as a currency too valuable to spend recklessly. If a partner backs out of a deal, he wouldn't rant or plead. He'd pivot, make them feel replaceable, and move on with efficiency that frightens them into returning. He'd prove that emotional control is the modern form of dominance. People think power is loud. Machiavelli would remind them, power is silent endurance. 3. Appear humble, but never forget your power. In today's age of performative modesty, Machiavelli would play humility like an actor plays a role. At work, he'd smile while others underestimate him, quietly absorbing information, resources, and trust. Then, when the moment comes, he'd strike, flawlessly executing a plan no one saw coming. His humility would be his disguise. In school, he'd tell ambitious students to blend in while building mastery. Don't boast about grades, let results expose your excellence. He'd explain that appearing harmless disarms envy. Make people think they're smarter, he'd say, while you're sharpening your blade. And in business, when rivals puff their chests in boardrooms, Machiavelli would stay silent, taking notes, learning weaknesses. Later, he'd acquire the clients they neglected. He'd never brag, because confidence built on results doesn't need to. In family, his humility would show as emotional restraint. He'd never compete for who's right. He'd let others win small arguments to win long-term influence. The Machiavellian parent or spouse doesn't dominate with noise but with calm consistency that others depend on. People trust those who appear humble, and Machiavelli would weaponize that trust. 4. Master silence. It's louder than words. Machiavelli would see the modern obsession with oversharing, everyone posting every argument, every failure, every private thought online, and he'd call it a self-destruction ritual. He'd say, the more you speak, the more they know where to stab. Silence, to him, would be the ultimate flex. In parenting, he'd advise, when your child screams, don't out-scream them. When they sulk, don't lecture. Stay silent until calm returns, then speak once, with authority. Silence unsettles rebellion. In school, silence would become confidence. A student who doesn't over-explain or boast builds mystery and respect. At work, the quiet worker who listens more than they talk becomes the one everyone turns to for final judgment. In business, Machiavelli would know that silence during negotiation terrifies people. He'd sit in meetings letting others talk themselves into weakness, then respond with a single sentence that cuts through all noise. In a world addicted to constant communication, the silent one becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability breeds power. 5. Use compassion strategically, never emotionally. Machiavelli would never advocate for cruelty, but he'd redefine compassion as a tool, not a reflex. In parenting, he'd teach, comfort your child only when they've learned the lesson. Never before. Reward without correction creates entitlement. If a child fails, don't rescue them immediately, guide them only after they've faced consequence. In school, this lesson applies to teachers and peers: help others, but not at the cost of your own progress. Machiavelli would see self-sacrifice without reciprocity as foolishness. Give when it strengthens you, he'd say, not when it empties you. In the workplace, he'd advise leaders to be firm but fair. When firing someone, do it cleanly, without apology, without anger. Compassion doesn't mean sparing everyone, it means preserving the system that supports many. In business, he'd show compassion through opportunity, not charity. He'd teach that generosity without structure becomes weakness. Real kindness, for him, is disciplined, not sentimental. 6. Expect betrayal. Prepare for it before it happens. Machiavelli would thrive in the modern age of backstabbing politics and social manipulation. He'd never be shocked by betrayal, he'd be insulted only if he didn't see it coming. In family, he'd notice alliances forming, siblings whispering, relatives gossiping, and he'd neutralize them through transparency. He'd expose potential conflicts before they fester, making betrayal impossible without consequence. At school, he'd tell students, not everyone smiling at you is your friend. He'd push them to observe who benefits from their effort. In workplaces, he'd document everything, every meeting, every agreement, not from paranoia, but from readiness. Trust, he'd say, is for those who've earned the risk. In business, he'd diversify deals, never putting all power in one partner's hands. If a partner defects, his empire doesn't shake, it adapts. Today's Machiavelli wouldn't cry about betrayal, he'd expect it, plan for it, and benefit from it. True confidence, he'd argue, comes from knowing loss won't destroy you. 7. Never beg, make people come to you. In the world of modern desperation, chasing attention, likes, validation, or opportunity, Machiavelli would be disgusted. Power dies when it kneels, he'd declare. Whether in love, work, or business, he'd make others move first. In parenting, he'd never beg for obedience. He'd create an environment where obedience is the child's natural response to structure and consistency. In family arguments, he'd never beg for peace, he'd create calm through presence, not pleading. In school, he'd teach, let your excellence attract attention. Don't beg for validation, earn visibility through undeniable skill. At work, Machiavelli wouldn't chase promotions. He'd make himself so indispensable that the company fears losing him. And in business, he'd never beg for deals, he'd make his offer so valuable that others initiate negotiation. This final lesson is what makes a person dangerously confident, the realization that neediness kills power. Once you stop chasing, the world starts turning in your direction. If Machiavelli lived today, he wouldn't rage at the softness of modern people, he'd exploit it. He'd find peace not in being adored, but in being untouchable. These 7 brutal lessons wouldn't make him cold, they'd make him unbreakable. Because in a world that rewards emotion over reason, his brand of confidence would look almost dangerous, calm, sharp, deliberate, and absolute. If this message hit you hard, like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. And subscribe for more Machiavellian truths every week. Because in a world full of noise, only the disciplined still rule.